This interview is lit intentionally. Skin is placed exactly where it should sit. The highlights are protected, the shadows falls exactly where I want them. But here's the real question. How do you create this look consistently without chasing exposure on your camera, without guessing with waveforms? The answer isn't ISO. It's not zebras. It's not even false color. It's deciding your look first, locking your camera, and shaping light in stops. Let me show you exactly how. Before I do anything as far as exposing the shot or controlling my lighting or even contrast ratio, I need to make decisions about my camera settings, because remember, camera settings are not exposure tools. They're here as a creative purposes. All those settings, whether it's aperture or shutter speed, have a purpose for creative, not simply to control exposure. And so we want to make those decisions actually prior to even getting on set. We need to look at the project that we're working on and make a decision, a creative decision on how do we want that shot to actually look like. Is it something that's very dark, very contrasty, or is it pretty soft and brightly lit? So those are decisions that we need to make. How much depth of field do we want? And so we're gonna make those decisions prior to the shoot, and then we're gonna set our camera with the settings that we want. And so I love shallow depth of field. We're gonna set our aperture to 1.4. My shutter is 1/60th. Now I'm shooting at 23.98, but my shutter is at 1/60th, and we're gonna leave it at that. Right now we have no ND, no anything else. When I did my web bounce, we landed at 4,200, almost 4,300. What we need to understand now is where does the skin tone needs to sit in relationship to middle gray. For most interviews, we want skin to sit about 1 to 1.5 stops above middle gray. And this applies across skin tones. Darker skin doesn't get exposed lower just because it's darker. It still lives above middle gray. Since my camera is locked at 1.4 and I want skin 1 stop above middle gray, that means I need to light the scene so that middle gray meter is at f2. That becomes our baseline. Everything we measure from this point forward will be compared to f2. And I would encourage you to also do decisions, make your decisions on how much contrast do you want. Contrast between the background with the shadows and the highlights, but also contrast on your subject's face. Here we're doing an interview, so it's important for us to understand what's our goal as far as the contrast between key light and field light. And so hopefully you can make those decisions in advance, and now it's about executing. All right, now that we have our camera settings set, we need to make sure that our light meter is actually set to the same settings as our camera. So we want to make sure that we have our shutter speed to 1/60th of a second, that our frame rate is right, that our ISO is correct. And here I'm using base ISO of 800. So what I now need to do is measure the different lights where I don't have control to see how far they are, how high they are, based off of the camera settings that I have, okay? And so we can look at the windows first. So I'm gonna point the spot meter towards the window, and I'm gonna get a measurement of 5.6. So this tells us the window is 3 stops above middle gray. We would need to close the aperture 3 stops to expose it properly. So that means the window is 3 stops brighter or above middle gray. And it's important for us to understand the dynamic range of this camera. So the FX6, we understand at base ISO has 6 stops above middle gray that it can see and 9 stops below. So we're still in range, nothing is blown out the window. The other one that we want to look at is this lamp, because of the time of day that we're in, this lamp looks a lot brighter than the window. So let's take a reading of the lamp, and it measures at f16. So f16, that's 6 stops above middle gray. And for me, that's a little too close for comfort. And so what we're gonna do now is, we don't wanna change our camera settings. Those are the settings that I wanna use. I don't wanna adjust my aperture or my shutter speed. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add some ND filter. So we need to decide how much ND we want to add in order to then protect our highlights. And let's say, because it's measuring at around 6 stops, let's say we want to add 3 stops of ND. So I'm going to turn it on where ND4, which is 2 stops. And in order for me to add 1 more stop, I'm going to double that. So instead of 4, we're going to get to an 8. And so now we know that our lamp back there, which was at 6 stops above, is now 3 stops above middle gray. And so we have plenty of room on our dynamic range. Now, I need to make sure that I add the ND filter that I just put in onto my meter, or else all my readings are going to be off. So we have a set filter compensation where I can just add 3 stops of ND. And now it shows that we have 3 stops of ND as a compensation. Okay, so that's kind of it as far as setting up our camera. We now have the settings that we want, and we're not going to touch it anymore. Now it's all about adding lights where we need to add light. All right, so let's bring our subject in. We'll have him sit in the chair. And what we want to do now is we want to use the meter to measure how much stops of light we need to add in order to expose him properly. And in this case, because he's looking this way, his right side here is going to be his key side. His left side is going to be his fill side. And so same thing, I'm just going to do a spot reading on his key side. And this one's a 0.5. And so we have at least 2 stops of lights that we need to add onto his key side. So I'm going to bring in my key light. And on this one, this is the Amaran 200X. We put the mini dome on it and put the egg crate because we want to try to keep as much of the light straight and avoid spills, because I want to do quite a bit of contrast between his key side and his fill side. And so we have the egg crate on there, and that will hopefully help us create more contrast. Now I want to put it at a pretty good angle so that I can, again, control the spill and avoid lighting up too much of his face. Now, the light is facing a light wall. It's not pure white, but it's pretty bright. So a lot of light is going to bounce off the wall, but that's okay. We'll deal with that. So let me turn this on. Let me turn this way down. And we'll start at 4%. My camera is set to 1.4, but remember that we need the meter to read 2.0. And so that will tell me middle gray will sit at 2.0, but I'm exposed 1 stop above, which will make his face 1 stop above middle gray. Okay, so we're going to read his key side, and this tells me 1. So we need to get to 2 in order to be 1 stop over. So we are 2 stops underexposed. So in order to add 2 stops, I'm going to do it one at a time, but we're basically going to double this light. So this light is right now at 4%. So if I go to 8%, that's 1 stop. And so now let's see what we read. We read 1.4. And so I need to add 1 more stop. So I'm going to double the percentage again. So here we're at 8%. We're going to go to 16. Right here. And now I can measure, and I get a 2. And so now we have skin tone exactly where we want it. And if we confirm that with the waveform monitor, go ahead and move your head there. So see, he's moving around the 55 to 60 IRE. Now this is Rec 709 that we're looking at. The beauty of working in stops is you don't have to worry about IREs. Right now we're looking at a waveform just to confirm what we're doing with the light meter, but you don't need to worry about, what does that mean or how does that translate in log or in Rec 709. When you work with a light meter and in stops, it's universal. So regardless of the camera that you're using, regardless of the log format that you're using, every camera, everything is based off of middle gray. So if you expose your skin tone 1 stop above middle gray, then it's going to come across regardless of the format that you're on. Okay. So now we're pretty good with him. We want to look at contrast, because now we have the exposure correctly, but we want to now decide what does our background look like, what does his fill side look like. On this particular meter, I can turn on this contrast function, and now the meter will measure in stops the difference between our middle gray of F2 and the new reading. He already is very contrasty, but let's figure out exactly how much. If I look and point to his fill, it is now telling me it's at half a stop below middle gray. But remember that his key side is 1 stop above middle gray. So we actually have a 1.5 stops difference between his key side and his fill side. So that is a 3-to-1 contrast ratio. I'm gonna add some negative on that wall behind him, just so that we can take some lights away. So let me bring this pop-up that has a full blackout on one side, and I'm just gonna leaning against the wall next to him. And you can see the difference here. We just wanna make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Now he's still getting some lights, and I think it's from the window that's next to him, or it's kind of like a little bit to the side. So we have another blackout. It's a smaller one right here. And I can just place that one. It's on an arm, so I can move it in a way that just blocks the window. So here's without it. And we can see on his face how much it changes already. Right here. Nice. So let me measure that fill side one more time. Okay, so now we have like 1.5 stops. That's a 2.5 stops difference with the key side. So now we have a 6-to-1 contrast ratio. So really the last thing that we need to do now is work our contrast in the rest of the frame. And you can see everything is sitting way, way below what we wanted to, right? So like all those shadows down there are completely crushed. We don't see any or very little details in that bookshelf. So we're gonna need to bring that up. And again, we need to make a decision here on how far we want our shadows to be. So same thing, I'm gonna point towards the bookshelf. And now I'm getting a 7 stop below middle gray. And we have a dynamic range of 9 stops, but the reality is those last few stops are all in the noise. So I wouldn't feel comfortable leaving it that way unless we really want to crush everything, but that still wouldn't be the right way to do it because we're still producing noise. And so what we want to do is raise it to a level where there is no noise. And then if we want to crush them in post, then we can crush them in post and we'll have no noise. And so I would feel much better if this sits at about 3 stops below. So we added the MRN 360C and then a 4x6 diffuser, and we're going to use that to raise the levels on our background. So we know right now it sits at about 7.5 stops below middle gray. And so I'm going to add light to probably bring it up to about 3 stops below middle gray. So I'm just going to set my the intensity of that light at about 5% right here. And now we can start seeing levels rising a little bit. We can start seeing some of the details on the bookshelf. We can take another reading to double check on our bookshelf. And we're still at about 6 stops. And so we need to add 3 stops. So I'm going to double this to 10%, and that's 1 stop. I'm going to double it again to 20% right here. And that's 2 stops. So let's see where we're at. Now we're starting to see the background a little bit. I'm going to read it again off that bookshelf. We're at about 4 stops. So we'll add 1 more. So we'll double that to 40%. There. And now our waveform is starting to look pretty good. Our picture is starting to look really good. So I'm going to measure again that bookshelf there. And I have 3 stops, actually still 3.5 stops. So we could raise it a little bit more, but it's starting to look pretty good. Let's raise the level by half a stop, so 60%. Looks good. Now, we spent so much time doing this that outside is getting completely dark, so now we're starting to see reflection in the window that we didn't have earlier of that diffuser. But that's okay, I'll leave it, understanding that all we would need to do is back that diffuser off a little bit so that we don't see that reflection back there. I want to take another reading of his key side because it's looking a little overexposed now. So he's now 2 stops above middle gray. That's the 360C light bleeding onto his face. So we should probably flag it, but for our example, I'll just lower the intensity of his key side by 1 stop. And so I'm gonna half of this, so it's at 16%, I'm gonna go to 8%. Okay, and now I can read it. Yeah, it's starting to look a lot better. There, so now he's back at 2, which is our 1 stop above. And so now, if I check it against the wall, we should have some separation. Yep. So we have another stop of separation between his key side and the wall. Because the whole game of contrast is to make sure we have separation between our highlights, our midtones, and our shadows. And because we lost the window completely, really our highlights is that lamp back there, which we know sits at about 3 stops above. He sits kind of in the middle at 1 stop above. So we have 2 stops of separation between him and the highlights. And then we have 3 stops below in the shadows, which gives us 4 stop difference between the shadows and his skin. And so now in post-production, we'll be able to manipulate everything. So his fill side now looks very, very contrasty. Let me measure this one. Yeah, so he's 3.5 stops difference, which that's a lot. So 1 stop would be 2-to-1 ratio, 2 stop would be 4-to-1 ratio, 3 stop would be 8-to-1 ratio, and he's above that. So he's sitting really, really dark. So now we can remove our neg and see what it does. Or what we can do is introduce a light to control the fill side. But by just removing the big pop-up, allowing the light to bounce off the wall, we now have a much better ratio here. Let me see what that is. So that's a two stop ratio. So that's a 4-to-1 ratio that we have, and that looks a lot better. Now he's wearing a hat, and so obviously in real life, if he was wearing a hat, I wouldn't put this light this high up because it's creating that big shadow line on his forehead. What we could do is introduce a bounce kind of like by his knee to like bounce some light underneath the hat a little bit. But again, the beauty of working this way is not only do you have full control over the exposure, you have full control over contrast, but now you're working away from what the camera is doing, what log profile you're using. Everything is universal when you work in stops. And when you're communicating with people, especially if you're working with professional gaffers, you can simply say, I need 1 stop of light added to that corner or wherever, and they'll know exactly how to give you 1 stop of extra light where you need it. So hopefully that was helpful. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Happy filming.